Good evening, dear panelists, viewers, donors, supporters, and well-wishers of Visamo Kids Foundation. It is an honor to have you all express solidarity and stand in support with Visamo Kids during the tough times caused by by the nature of the pandemic. Abiding by the Calrock's core value of living in the gap and relentless repeatability, we bring you yet another interesting panel that has been curated to discuss a very crucial aspect in today's times, that of our heritage. Before setting the tone for the day, I would like to before before setting the tone for the day, I would like to welcome you all to Visamo Kids Foundation Facebook page. Visamo Kids Foundation is a shelter home under Kellogg's Foundation, working with underprivileged kids from interior, remote, rural area across the state through a network of grassroots NGOs. These kids are identified and selected by using screening test. After their admission into the home, the kids are groomed for admission into the finest schools of Ahmedabad under CBSE, ICSE and State Board, such as DPS Bhopal, Zydus, Zeber, Anand Niketan, Satyamev Jayate, Saint Kabir, Udgam, etc. Currently, we house 100 plus kids from age 5 to 17 years studying in the grade 1 to 12. 40 plus students have graduated out of home after completing their studies and are pursuing higher education. Many have started giving back to the society and started supporting their families. Due to the pandemic, the kids are not at the shelter home at present and have been sent back to their families. They are overcoming challenges to attend schooling using online platform and support from their school team and Visamo teachers. Since June 2020, we have been focusing on expanding our online engagement and digital presence by conducting talks by guest speakers from diverse stakeholder group associated with Visamo Kids. From September onwards, we are hosting webinars on this page to engage with the community with diverse issue that needs to be discussed widely. This is one such platform hosting a discourse on a topic that relates to each and every. We have an inherent responsibility to protect and preserve the natural heritage and our tangible heritage. But heritage also refers to living heritage like customs, rituals, literature, and the performing arts. Traditional societies like India are especially rich in this domain for intangible cultural heritage. It is a well accepted fact that conservation will become unsustainable without local community participation. Effective participation relates to empowerment, communication, and responsibility. With this, I once again invite you all to join the discussion. The topic, whose heritage is it anyways, is directly towards understanding the managing traditional and indigenous community knowledge, intangible culture, heritage, tangible heritage sites, and explore the intersection with socio-economic development. Without wasting further time, I would like to invite our panelists to take over from me. I would request the viewers to kindly type in your questions in the chat box. We would be taking your questions after the discussion round is over. I would now like to invite our first panelist, Mr. P.K. Ghosh. Sir was born in Calcutta, did his schooling from the prestigious Scottish Church Collegiate School and graduated from the eminent Presidency College, Kolkata. He joined the Indian Administrative Services in 1967 He worked in the field of urban administration for more than a decade, and after retirement also is associated with urban issues. He was involved in the conservation initiative of the old city of Ahmedabad. He is presently working as the chairman of the Heritage Conservation Committee of Ahmedabad. He has deep interest in philosophy, literature, history, architecture, and music. I extend a warm welcome to you, Ghosh sir, for making time for the webinar. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. I'll request only one thing. Instead of calling me Ghosh sir, you can just call me Mr. Ghosh.
Sure, sir. Sure.
Okay. The caption which has been given for today's discussion brings up a very, very important issue. Often, conservation of heritage is seen as something which is to be done. It's a thing which the learned or fashionable people do. As a result, it is becoming, in some section, as a statement of being alive to the fashion which is going on in the society today. But when I say this is my heritage, that means something which has been left for me by my predecessor, which I value. I will like to tell you a story. Only last week, I got a communication from one of my friends whose third generation America settled granddaughter, in relation granddaughter, has written a beautiful essay on the trilogy of Satyajit Ray, that is Pather Panchali, Apur Sangsar, and Aparajita. And while doing that analysis, at every stage, she is trying to relate the Apu's situation with her personal relation with the relatives in the extended joint family in Bengal and partially in America also. This kind of relating the things makes this particular trilogy or Vibhuti Bhushan's writing her heritage. Unless we are able to relate the things which you see somewhere with my experience, my feelings, it doesn't become a heritage. That is my strong feeling, and it is getting stronger. When I see people talk a lot of things about the heritage, but they do not mind putting an intangible heritage down in the city to take advantage of its position for building a new house, a new building, or new multi-story building. So therefore, that kind of feeling that it is mine is not there many times. Many times it is there also. Now, our main effort should be, if I call Ahmedabad, old Ahmedabad city, a heritage city, how exactly I can see that the feeling of this being my own, giving a part of his as if he is associated with that heritage. Unless we succeed in creating that kind of feeling, heritage conservation will be a very difficult task. And intangible heritage, there are, I think, 350 and odd varieties of Ramayana in various places. Our Banaskantha has got a variety of Ramayana, an edition of Ramayana. I'm not talking of the Jain versions of Ramayana. Now, this Banaskantha tribal edition of Ramayana, fortunately, has been recorded by the Banaskantha people. I think it has been printed also. Then I am reminded of a particular community, a linguistic group, small, very small tribal group in Purulia district of West Bengal, whose members are there in Chotanagpur, in Chhattisgarh, in Raipur area. Now that their language is becoming extinct. Now they call Bengali their father language and the tribal language their mother language. The other day, one of them said, if our language vanishes, then with it will vanish a lot of things which are held in our tribal memory about the very easy remedies for various kinds of common diseases, even difficult diseases. This is wealth. With the disappearance of the language, this also will disappear. So these two things bring up. One is lack of feeling of owning that particular thing in case of tangible thing, in case it collides with the real estate interest, which I am seeing day in and day out in Ahmedabad and Gujarat, different places. And other thing is a loss of information, knowledge, insight in certain things, which is content in a language which is on the point of disappearance. English is killing languages all over the world, but in our India also, the languages are disappearing. With it, various kinds of wealth which is already stored in that language. I thought I'll begin with these 2 points. So I'm handing it over to you. Let us start.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your vast knowledge and experience with us. I now welcome Ms. Santala from Imphal, Manipur. Thank you, madam, for joining the webinar today.
Hi, hello, good evening, everyone.
Ms. Santala is the co-founder of Multipurpose Livestock and Organic Farmers Women's Society.
Yes.
And Kangism Village, Chandel, an initiative to ensure inclusion of upland areas, women farmers in development in 2017. The founder of Sounds of Mountains, Shades of Life, an initiative since 2019 to preserve the conserve and unique traditional knowledge and practices with the same. Livelihood through conservation and spearheading the development and seeding of food forest to bring back the undying bond between forest dwellers and their ancestral land. A postgraduate from Delhi School of Social Works, University of Delhi, Ms. Santala has over 2 decades of experience on sustainable livelihood policies and strategies with special references to upland areas. An expert of community institutions building and their trainer of women groups like farmers groups, SHGS and village federations. She is a member of Makam Mahila Kisan Adhikar Manch, a Pan India Women Farmers Forum, a conservationist, and an tree planter. Ms. Santala is herewith invited to share her experience on the disaster preparedness of indigenous group of the Northeast. Now to you, madam.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, madam.
Hello. Okay. Thank you for the nice for the introduction. Today I'm going to share my learnings and my experience, like how the indigenous people use their knowledge and practices to overcome or mitigate disasters. It's like when I was working, that was way back in 2015, when the whole of Manipur state was suffering from this flood, and most of the part of Manipur was inundated at that time, and we were working to see like how much it was affected, and various organizations were also carrying out with the relief and everything. But when we go down to the village where we were working, we find that in some particular village where they are still living with their indigenous skills and knowledge, especially in agriculture and in horticulture methodologies, they were able to sustain, they were able to pull through that disaster without any without any difficulty. So that is how we have found out. And another one is that in that particular time, in other part of the state, in one particular village where they have done this monocropping, which is not a traditional way of farming, we found that they have suffered huge landslides And not only that, and their food security was an issue because they have done monocropping. And when the disaster strikes, they were looking out for relief materials from other sources, which was quite difficult at the time because traveling, transportation, everything was like it came to a standstill at that time because of the disaster. So what I have personally experienced is that like the villages or the communities which has adopted and still retain the traditional knowledge and skills and the practices in their life, daily life, either in the while taking up this agriculture, horticulture, and even in the collections of the non-timber forest products, they were able to sustain their life and meet any sort of issues that comes up from time to time. So that is what I have learned. And everybody knows that, especially in the northeastern states, we have lots of indigenous people, and we are the custodians and the guardians of these natural resources. Because we the indigenous people, we have a special connection with this nature, and we have a very special connectivity with our own land, water, animals, seasons, birds, etc. Like, and the indigenous people, we depend on nature to lead our day-to-day life. We study the behavior of the birds, the reptiles, insects, and wild animals to live on with our lives. We rely on the signs of this nature, and we coexist with the nature. So that's how indigenous and or traditional knowledge, we coexist together since the last generations till now. And what we have done is that in order to mitigate such disaster, we indigenous people, what we have is that we have different mechanisms which are like time tested. And such mechanism I can mention is like we have seasonal calendars. We have these seasonal calendars are drawn up since our forefathers. We have every routine or every plan out, like when to cut the bamboo, when to harvest the bamboo shoot, everything has been planned out. So we have a seasonal calendar, and this is also one of our most important traditional knowledge, and we still practice that one. Then we have this post-harvest management system, which ensures preservations of indigenous seeds for next season. And this is also one of the most important thing which ensure us to sustain ourselves when any disaster strikes, because the preservation of the seeds, the preservations of the vegetables has been the knowledge has been transferred from our forefathers to us. And there are different methods, there are different ways how to preserve the seeds, how to preserve the vegetables, and how to preserve the other food materials which will be needed in the course of the time. And another one is a very important thing that we have under this indigenous knowledge is that we have actually why we can sustain why we can sustain ourselves is that in our traditional knowledge in terms of farming, we've actually followed a very indigenous model of integrated farming, where we can harvest 7 to 8 type of crop from a single plot of farmland. Actually, this methodology is now very debatable because of this slash and burn. Some group of people are saying that this is causing degeneration of the forest. But if we really look into the traditional methods, the traditional knowledge, skill, and practices, if we really look into it, this is a model indigenous model of integrated farming. From a single plot of land, we can get at least 7 to 8 crops. And in this type of farming, rejuvenation of the slashed and the burnt trees are also kept in the mind. So that is what I would like to say. Like we indigenous people, we keep ourselves prepared not only at the time of the disaster, but our whole lifestyle, our seasonal calendar, our way of farming, our way of maintaining the linkage with the nature, always ensure us to keep to be in preparedness of if any disaster strikes. That's what I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you, madam, for sharing your experience and views.
Hmm.
To put a portrait of Northeast in it. I move to our next eminent speaker, a researcher from Shillong, Meghalaya, a region also known as the Scotland of India. Ms. Somo Wangchung is trained as an urban planner from School of Planning and Architecture, Delhi. Belonging from an indigenous region of Meghalaya, she presented her bachelor's and master's thesis research taking Shillong as case study, as it is very different from other parts of the country, especially in the form of constitutional laws and governance. Currently, she is working as a researcher in the Center of Land Governance team for the past 1 year, and her research interest includes land system, land records, governance, and institutional framework, role of gender in decision-making process, etc. She has a growing interest from traditional knowledge systems, local governance, and community participations and planning, which she feels is very good when it comes to resilient building and strategies for the future. I welcome Soma Madam to the platform and request you to share your thoughts on traditional institutions of Meghalaya.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. As Mr. Thakur introduced me, I belong from an indigenous region of Meghalaya. So I'll be speaking on the governance setup of Meghalaya, which I feel is very much in sync or related to the topic that we are discussing today. So as we all know, Meghalaya is one of the most beautiful states in the country. But along with it, it lies, there's a very complex setup of governance. First, we have the formal set of governing bodies, just like it's prevalent in the rest of the country, such as municipalities, urban authorities, etc. Secondly, what is very different in Meghalaya is that Meghalaya forms under the 6th schedule of constitution. So we have autonomous district councils of the 3 major tribes in Meghalaya, which was formed to, sort of give a greater autonomy to the tribal communities and sort of protect their practices and rights. And finally, the third form of governance we have is the traditional institutions. So when we speak of heritage, right, I will be speaking in the intangible form of heritage, which will be, again, in the form of traditional institutions, as this has been existing for a really long time in the state. So the state, it was exempted from 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act because the government sort of believed that they already had a grassroots administration. But these institutions, they are not formally recognized under any central laws. But again, they are protected under the laws of autonomous councils, which gives them the power to manage, administer, and make decisions pertaining to their boundaries. So in Meghalaya, it is not the state government, but it is more of autonomous council and tribal institutions, which are the primary functionaries for administrating and management. So what I believe is that these institutions, they form a basis of the indigenous rights and practices in the state that needs to be protected. Although there are several complexities in the entire political system and management, these grassroots institutions, they are very powerful authorities in their respective regions. Since they have governed, their tribal communities and their land since ages. And so people sort of defer to them and the decisions they make. These bodies, they have always been sort of community-driven institutions, and they also act as a bridge between the modern state and the tribal communities. I'll give you a very recent example. Like, right now, the country is going through crisis because of COVID. So right now, even for the COVID management, the state government have been in Meghalaya. The state governments, they have been actively collaborating with the traditional institutions, mostly through the local area headmen, as we call them, for more effective administration and supervision. So what happens is that these traditional institutions, they rely on community participation, because these communities, they volunteer themselves and they make up the task forces. So these task forces and the volunteers, they are in constant vigilance, especially in the containment areas. So they kind of ensure that people are staying at home, the shops are closed, the vehicular movements are restricted, and so on. So like even when I had gone home during the COVID scene, like a few months back, it was compulsory for me to stay for 2 weeks of institutional quarantine and followed by 2 weeks of home quarantine. So a lot of these scenes are quite similar in the rest of the country. But who are there? Are there any bodies or institutions that's kind of checking, having a check on them? In Meghalaya, when I stayed at home for 2 weeks, there were these communities and the volunteers which were looked upon, who would come every day to check if we were at home, and they were providing us essential commodities. So once the entire circle of 28 days was complete, a health certificate was given to us declaring our completion of quarantine. And then the copy was to be submitted to the headman, who would keep it as a record. So what I'm trying to say here is, while the formal government systems and the autonomous councils in Meghalaya, they take care of the general affairs, and they also have the power to make laws. But it is the traditional institutions who administer at grassroots levels, and they work for the community on day-to-day management. And when I say day-to-day management, it includes all sort of like settlement of local disputes, management of land, provision of basic services, etc. So what I believe is that such decentralization form of governance, these are being facilitated by people's support. So they are very significant because they center people's needs and they strengthen the form of existing political structure that we have. So I would conclude by saying that these local institutions, I feel, need to be empowered so that they can exist alongside, alongside the formal government agencies, and granting them more legitimacy can enable them to have a greater say in several decision-making processes. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, madam, for presenting insight view of on the topic. Speaking now is Mr. Jitu Mishra from Bhubaneswar. Mr. Jitu Mishra, an archaeologist, by training from Pune Deccan College, has been in the field of education for more than 15 years. He was associate as a senior education specialist with Educational Initiatives, a non-profit organization in Ahmedabad. He has co-founded Virasat-e-Hind Foundation, a heritage-focused organization registered in Ahmedabad. Recently, he has co-founded another organization, Sarna Education and Cultural Resources in Bhubaneswar. He was a Wipro Fellow between 2017 January and 2020 January. Mr. Mishra is a historian, blogger, and anthropologist. Welcome you, sir, to present your views on the farming heritage with focus on indigenous tribes.
Thank you, Mr. Thakur. I hope I am audible.
You are.
So, yeah. So when I belong to Bhubaneswar, and but I have lived in Ahmedabad for a very long time, between 2003 and 2018, for almost 15 years. So now I have shifted to Bhubaneswar, and my focus has been on cultural heritage of intangible as well as tangible cultural heritage of Odisha, and also linking it with the education system. So let me start with a small thing, like, when we think about education in our curriculum, mostly in the high schools. So when we talk about the agricultural heritage or agricultural practices in India, so the focus is more on the green revolutions or the modern agriculture. Whereas we have completely forgotten, ignored the aspects of indigenous farmings, and whether it is in Odisha or else rest in the rest of India. So indigenous agricultural practices, which have been going on for thousands of years, have lot of interesting facets, and which are very relevant in the current situations when we are going through the uh, global climate change. So in the context of Odisha, which is where about 24 percentage of the population are tribal communities, and you have both Austroasiatic tribes as well as Dravidian tribes. And Odisha was like, a meeting point of various tribal communities. And many of these tribal communities have history of living in the Eastern Ghats Mountains and the Chotanagu Plateau for more than 5,000-6,000 years. And very few people would know that, because when we talk about rice, one of the staple foods of the entire world communities, especially in the eastern part of the world, uh, is that China and Thailand are considered as the origin of rice. We haven't got any archaeological proof, but the region in the southern part of Eastern Ghats in Odisha, where you have, it's called Koraput Plateau, where there were about 2 to 3,000 varieties of rice being cultivated, wild rice. And today also you will find about 100 to 200 varieties of wild rice. And uh, and this makes it very interesting. And there are some anthropologists who are of the view that it could be also one of the origins of rice, Asiatic rice, though we haven't proved yet. But this shows that how rich is the indigenous knowledge system of rice cultivations. So there is a lady called Kamla Pujari who has not gone to even school, but she has been preserving this wild rices in the Koraput Plateau, and she has recently got Padma Shri Award for that, and she's working with the Swaminathan Research Institute also. And I was fortunate to meet her. So that shows that how developed is the indigenous knowledge system when it comes to the rice cultivations. Besides rice, you have varieties of millets, which is again a staple food in the indigenous part of Odisha, and you have varieties of millets. Besides, you have different methods of farming. Of course, slash and burn cultivation, what we call Podu Chasa in Odia, has it is quite debatable, because there are some anthropologists, there are some people they are in favor of it, there are some people they are against of it. But what has happened, because of the population explosion and non-availability of the common land, farming land, so more and more tribal communities are opting for this slash and burn cultivations. So anyway, that has led to the deforestations. But when we look at the how they preserve the seeds and the varieties of rice and millets, and as well as others, and they don't buy from the market, and they do a several series of rituals at different cycles, agricultural cycles, and that is very relevant. And and it is and some of these crops are also considered as climate change resilience. So it is very important for us to to highlight these aspects of our indigenous agricultural practices, whether it is in Odisha or elsewhere in the country, in the educational curriculum, especially when the children are taught about our agricultural practices in the country. So this is what I had to tell. And so we have just started our research in documentation of this farming methods, different farming methods. So and also the way they do water harvesting, because the Eastern Ghat also, though there is it receives quite a bit rainfall, but what happens, most of the water drains and to the rivers because of the slopes. And how do they manage the water management is also very important. So these are some of the areas where we are working, and will be working more in the near future after the COVID situation becomes little normal, and try to bring in also, educate our children about the indigenous agriculture practices happening in the state. So that is what I had to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your valuable views and enrich our knowledge. We now invite Ms. Nishita Banerjee on the panel to share her views on how the heritage in handed down over generations and why it is important to acknowledge such traditions. Ms. Nishita Banerjee studied history from Lady Shri Ram College for Women and has been working at the grassroots from the last 5 years. She was part of the Gandhi Fellowship in Rajasthan, where she ran an enterprise on menstrual health management. In the years following, she worked with artisanal community across India and with the Chief Minister's office in Haryana as a young professional. She currently works with the Indian Institute of Human Settlements as a researcher. Her interests lay in understanding India's cultural heritage, traditional and indigenous knowledge system, and its intersection with socio-economic development. Over to you, madam.
Thank you so much, Mr. Thakkar. Since I'm working as a researcher at IHS, and we've been looking around at discourses on heritage, and this is something that I wanted to speak on today. As academicians, when we study heritage, it's mostly limited. It's largely, I would say, a large part of discourse is limited to understanding historical buildings. And, monumentality is a very important aspect to understand what heritage is. The community around the historical building is taken into consideration, and that is something which is studied. Now, today in the panel, I wanted to raise a question, and I wanted to sort of see if this, if we can reevaluate the understanding of heritage at a very micro level, while at a more national level, we talk about how historical policies should be, how local governance should function, but who is basically safeguarding this heritage? What sort of heritage is being practiced or safeguarded at a very family unit is something that I wanted to explore today. And I feel somewhere discourses around heritage has largely been, largely focuses around built heritage, because there seems to be a gap in understanding how we perceive heritage in our everyday lives, especially in India, where everything is so oral and there is no large documentation of what comes as heritage, what is knowledge. Everything's passed on orally from one generation to the other. So I think so we could understand who holds this knowledge, how is this knowledge passed on, and how do we understand how this knowledge should be passed on, and who should be recognized when we talk about heritage. So last year I was working with a professor called Rashmi Singh from Ashoka University, and that's where we started exploring families and heirloom of families, and we tried to understand role of women and their associated livelihoods, and these sort of activities that women do in Indian households, I would say, which are basically given to women from a long time, like stitching, pickling, or like crochet, needlework. And is this considered as heritage, or this is something which is mostly looked as hobby or like craft work until unless it is capitalized on and sent out in the market? And it is only then when we recognize women made things as craft and art. But this is also an important, a very important knowledge source, because when we talk about intangibility, it's actually how are women sort of safeguarding these knowledge? How is it being passed on within the families? And if the larger art discourse sort of recognizes this as part of heritage, and these activities have been assigned to women, and a dominant art and heritage discourse invalidates it. These are activities which are seen as things which are done within the families, and there is a need to sort of expand our ideas of heritage and look into these sort of interventions which are required to sort of recognize who owns the heritage after all. I wanted to highlight a few initiatives that are going around in the world. There's something called as the Anonymous Was a Woman, an initiative which is being done in New York, which sort of recognizes poems written by women. A large number of poems which were written by women in early 1900s were not signed off, like they were mostly kept anonymous. And now this historian and an art curator is trying to see who finally wrote these poems, and it's called as Anonymous Was Women. And another initiative which is going on in Italy by Arif Erkan, he's also trying to look at the material culture which are held in households by women, like heirloom, like we keep saris of our grandmothers and it's kept safe and passed on from one generation to the other. So these are the things which are being brought out to sort of unearth these histories, to scratch the surface and understand finally who is the one who's owning the heritage, or who is the one who's sort of responsible for taking this forward as a family unit. And I think so it's time that India also sees all of these things, because it's after all our mothers and our grandmothers who've taught us all of these things, and it's time to recognize the female labor in discourses around heritage. That's how I would like to sum it up. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. Thank you, dear panelists, for sharing your experiences and views with the audience with such generosity. I now would like to take a few questions. The first question is to Mr. Jitu Mishra, sir. What is the purpose of utility of memory? What is the relevance and preserving physical objects and intangible heritage?
Okay, so heritage to me is actually not history, it is the way of life. Because what we have inherited from our ancestors, and it becomes very relevant today, because when today, especially during the time of this pandemic, we have realized that how our traditional food is so relevant. We have in last few years or in last few decades, we have gone ahead to adopt the Western foods, for example, pizza and burger and so many things. But how that have not been, these foods are not important. I mean, they cause a lot of problems, health problems that people have started realizing. So in that way, like the way we have inherited from our past generations, it's like, and are found very essential today, and in many aspects, like whether it is the traditional houses, or it is the utensils where we eat, or the kind of food we eat, the kind of garments we would use. So these are very important in today's context, and what our ancestors, for example, have evolved with these ideas, evolved with these knowledge systems. It's not happened just overnight. It has taken thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. And today, just within few years, we are forced to change our lifestyle, and that is causing the problems. So in that way, I think the intangible heritage, and not only just conserving but also practicing them, is very relevant today.
Very true, sir. Very true. Thank you, sir. I move on to the young researchers, Somo and Nishita, madam. My question is, how can researchers and practitioners in the field of cultural heritage develop more inclusive approaches to share heritage in order to transgress social and political boundaries?
Yeah. So I think an important aspect in India is to definitely look at oral and neighborhood histories. When we are trying to understand about a monument, it is not only the architectural value of a monument or how well it has been designed. And this is something both Somo and I are currently working on. And we are trying to see of how a community around a monument or a built heritage looks at it. What are the stories? How has the community grown around the monument to talk what are the conversations around it, what is the economy around it? And this is something which really needs to be taken into consideration. Oral history is something which is not explored that much in India, where everything in India is oral. And I think so that can be a tool which can be adopted to writing better histories, explore more diverse history and more diverse opinions. Soma, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'd like to pitch in my opinion. So what I feel is cultural heritage is something which is not static, right? Although it is a vestige of the past that needs to be preserved, but it is rather more like a driving force that needs to be brought into the cities or towns. The past is like a tool for building the future. So understanding of the past will sort of unite communities, and it will empower people to imagine a shared future. Okay, so towards this, I feel like participatory practices should be aimed, because it will enhance the social inclusion of even the most disadvantaged citizens. Nowadays, in many policies and development-oriented studies, we see that they have come to realize that to achieve any good result, local governments are something they are focusing on, because they sort of bring the civil society together. So this kind of brings in an instrument to sort of boost a social equity and acceptability, and also kind of legitimize the local policies and their outcomes. So I think practices of citizen participation, it will kind of reinforce even the social capital asset of local communities, and that will help to solve emerging inequalities that's very much prevalent in our country. So yeah, I would just end up by saying that the trust and like various shared norms and even the values, which are, these are something which is expected to kind of strengthen the socialities within the local communities, and this will help to bridge the social connections within the city as a whole. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for enlightening the panel and viewers. Moving on to Ms. Ronglu, madam, do you think that heritage should not be discussed as an academic issue alone, but also in connection to power relations? I think she's on mute mode.
Purna?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, madam. Yeah.
Hello?
Yes, madam.
Okay.
Shall I repeat?
Yeah, please.
Okay, 1 minute, madam. My question is,
Hello?
that do you think that heritage should not be discussed as an academic issue alone, but also in connection to power relations?
Actually, heritage, it should be discussed in all the sectors of daily life, whether it is in politics or in academics, because like everybody has agreed to that whatever traditional knowledge, it is diminishing, because most of the traditional knowledge are orally transferred or either seen through it's transferred through the practices. If I have seen my grandmother doing zooming, then I will automatically learn that one. But if my children doesn't see me doing the zooming, they will not learn that particular skill. So what I meant to say here is that heritage, whether tangible or intangible, they should be brought into the context of the academic research, and it should be well documented. Actually, traditional skills, traditional practices, traditional knowledge, they need to be documented. They need to be researched, because our human society is based on this traditional knowledge only. Whatever science and technology that we are developing is all based on these traditional beliefs and knowledge. That is what I have observed. Because my experience is that grandparents used to tell us, don't come into the house with your shoes on. Or when you go to the sanitary toilet, don't come inside the house until and unless you wash yourself. These are all traditional ideas which they have given to us orally, and practically they have transferred this knowledge to us. But if you really look into that from the scientific or research or day-to-day, this modern time of belief, then it is very scientifically linked, like when they said those things. So what I felt is that traditional knowledge needs to be researched, it should be discussed, and we have traditional knowledge, also we have this traditional governance, we have these traditional bodies, and they are the base of these political scenarios in each area. Because like I agree with Sumo when she said, like, we in the tribal areas, we have these 6 schedules, and 6 schedules, we have our own political sets of constitutions under that 6 schedules. So obviously it should be discussed in all the sectors. It should be brought into the parameters. These parameters should be there. Thank you.
Thank you, Manu. And now the question is for Mr. Ghosh. Okay, we will continue the program now. I would suggest that I would like to share a few questions shared by our viewers. Let me check if they have any questions here. Okay. Thank you, dear audience, for joining the talk and engaging with the panel. Thank you, dear panelists, for making time for the discussion and sharing your wisdom, knowledge, and experiences from the field to enrich the discussion. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Villages, rural areas. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, one particular language which is almost on the point of extinction in West Bengal and Chotnagpur and Odisha area, they say that with the extinction of our knowledge, you'll be losing our language, will be losing a storehouse of knowledge relating to the flora, fauna, and how to tackle the human life when the disease is coming. Even when there is a, not pandemic exactly, there is an epidemic sort of thing, there are built-in remedies or there are certain knowledge available with the tribe. Now, as has been pointed out, I find that there's a need for orientation in this research for this kind, collection of this kind of data. It is being collected, but not in full volume or not in a systematic fashion, one. But what is there, thereafter, analyzing them from the modern scientific point of view is not being done in a thorough way. Very scarcely one or 2 points will be taken up, but nothing more than that. Now, one point, the other day I saw one video on paddy cultivation in Bangladesh. Now, Bangladesh, they had a particular type of paddy called Uri Dhan, Uri. URI, Uri Dhan. Now, Uri Dhan will not be giving you a lot of grains, but they are capable, or they were capable of withstanding the saline water ingress. Even if a lot of saline water is there, they will be giving you some paddy. Whereas the modern hybrids which have been introduced and widely practiced in lower Bangladesh, they will be giving you a lot of grains, but they do not have any dam power to withstand the saline water. So if the saline water drips in, which quite often comes in Bangladesh, you'll be getting zero. So how to develop the Uri Dhan as yet has not been done in such a thorough fashion, perhaps in Bangladesh. Same thing is there in West Bengal lower side. This is lost, almost lost. In our Gujarat, you know, perhaps you know the Al grass. Do you know it? Al grass in Odisha, in Gujarat, near Bharuch. You have got that Al grass cultivation in the small island sort of thing, which is no longer an island now today. But Al grass is the original black paddy. The rice which comes out of that is black. So people will not accept it. But can it be developed in such a way that the blackness to some extent goes down? And can we project the food value of this kind of Al paddy? It is our Gujarat's own property. We do not, many of us do not know. One thing, the fact that such kind of things are existing, that should be brought to the notice of, even at the school level, these are things that are getting lost. I mean, all the grains. How many varieties of bajra and jowar are there? We don't know. But we should know at least the basic varieties of bajra jowar other than the high-yielding hybrid variety. Same thing with the cotton also. Our things we should know. Other day I suggested to a school in Gandhinagar that they should have 2 classes. One day all the local trees and plants should be introduced with photographs, and another period for local birds and animals. For instance, Gandhinagar once upon a time had lots of golden orioles. Even today, golden orioles are there in Gandhinagar. And Gandhinagar is full of leverna. Who planted them, I don't know, part of the forest department. But the students in the schools do not know what is called laburnum, what is called amultas, what is golden oriole, and what is the Gujarati name for it. So these are the things which should be introduced. Over and above that, slightly in the higher stage, the indigenous information which particularly has been mentioned by Manipur, by Meghalaya, those are absolutely essential. I've seen them, and those are still being practiced in certain pockets, but on the whole, it is not being practiced in such a way. So therefore, the total orientation or the predominance of the tangible heritage orientation in the form of monuments, in the form of build structure, that needs to be supplemented by orientation towards this kind of intangible knowledge. I'm talking of knowledge, which is still available. And before it's too long, before it's lost, there should be an attempt to make people, the students particularly, aware of it, and later on so that they can take up the job of collection, analysis, and then presenting the people, the community, what exactly is there. But one thing is very, very important is the Meghalaya's administrative system, delivering goods to public, authenticating the things which are to be done by the entire community. This kind of thing, perhaps Meghalaya is still an exception. It is gradually getting lost. Gujarat had a community orientation, but that no longer is there. In the cooperative society housing where we live, there is not a community. We live together, that's all, in the spatial and a limited space, that's all. That community thing has totally been broken down. I don't know how to retain it, how to bring it back, but Meghalaya fortunately has got it. And Meghalaya has got another unique thing, at least I found it to be unique. They do not have any institutional religion. Am I correct? And yet they have got something called values that is exclusively between an individual and some power, but not institutional religion. It has got a tremendous, I will say, good effect. No other tribal community or no other community I have seen having this kind of religion. There is a religion, but not institutional religion. There is no church, no temple. Am I correct? This is the thing. Also help them to building community without bringing religion. Otherwise, you will see wherever the community feeling is there, invariably religion group or religious leader with him, with his help, that community feeling is sought to be fostered. There's Swaminarayan, a Falana Peer. But without that also it is possible to keep your community sense alive. That is not that, but I do not know how to cultivate that. I will request her to Sobo to come down here to teach us. But this is a unique thing. Other parts of India I have not seen. I've been to all these places. I have stayed in Meghalaya. I have And Odisha is my, what shall I say, in tribe, so a few tribals in Bangladesh and Bengal, they called Bangla to be Pitri Bhasha and their tribal language to be Matri Bhasha. If my mother, if I can call it motherland or whatever, that kind of maternal relation is there with Bangladesh, my relation is equally deep with Odisha. And I can't forget, if anybody asks me, you name two tangible heritages in the form of monuments which are great, I will, without batting an eyelid, I will say Lingaraj Temple and Taj Mahal. Both of them. Taj Mahal has got no comparison. Lingaraj Temple also has not got any comparison. Now, these are the things which have to be brought into the students right from the beginning, make them sensitive towards it, and make them aware that these certain things which are getting lost still available. If you want, you can collect it, you can help in collecting it. So this, I thought, I have learned from this particular discussion or seminar or webinar, whatever you call it.
Thank you, sir, for your insightful response. Thank you, dear panelists, for making time for the discussions and sharing your wisdom, knowledge, and experiences from the field to enrich the discussion. Here in conclusion, I would like to add few points. There is no life without roots, no identity without history, no future without the past. The panel of experts tonight has brought important questions into the limelight, linking the issue that concern everyone who want to give great things from the past a new life. What is heritage and whose is it? What is emerging out of the discussion in the nutshell is that to preserve heritage significance of distinct culture communities, it is important to carry out a series of participatory assessment exercises with representatives of diverse ethnic and cultural groups. With that, I wish you all a good night and please do enjoy a great weekend. Thank you once again
Thank you.
for contributing
Thank you so much.
generously to the knowledge tree of Visamo.
Hello.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.